trying to tackle what should I know about clinical trials. I think clinical trials, obviously, something we are all heavily involved with, and something we think is extremely important for our patients and for the future of melanoma treatment. So I always kind of try to take it back to patients and patient care. And I thought back to a patient I had 10 years ago now. And so this patient actually presented to me with metastatic melanoma. And unfortunately, this is her PET scan back in 2014. She had these big bright spots are in her liver, and those are large metastasis of melanoma. She also had involvement in her bones and lungs, and so pretty widespread disease with melanoma. And in 2014, we were just on the cusp of a few new approvals for immunotherapy, which Dr. Waite covered, but options were just starting to emerge, right? And so I talked to her even about clinical trials at that point. And we'll come back to this patient here towards the end, but just wanted to kind of throw that out as a patient case, because I think that's always important. What are clinical trials? I think, clinical trials and research, maybe the media and Hollywood doesn't always do us good favors. Here's kind of the first thing that comes to my mind when I think about scientists and research, right? We've got our Back to the Future mad scientists. We've got the Hulk. We've got Frankenstein. And those are kind of images, we grow up with when we think about scientists and research sometimes. And I think sometimes that maybe turns people off of research a little bit and sort of has people scared about research. And so I think it's really important to think about what research is and what we're trying to do and why we're trying to do research. This is why we're trying to do research. This is looking at new cancer drugs approved by the FDA just per year over time. And there's just been a explosion per year of new oncology drugs really over this last 10 to 20 years. And this only goes through about 2016, but it's even exploded more over the last 5 to 10 years. And so there's been an exponential growth in oncology drug treatment, which is awesome because that means we're getting better outcomes. We're having people live longer, better, free of cancer, or continuing to live even with their cancer. And just amazing to see how much progress we've made over the last 10 to 20 years. And that's all because of research and clinical trials and how important that is. In melanoma specifically, there's just been an explosion, right, of FDA approvals of new drugs. And so you can see on the left, 1974, we had a chemotherapy drug called dacarbazine that we used for advanced melanoma. There wasn't a new really approval for melanoma until 1998, which was systemic IL-2, kind of that first proof of immunotherapy being a treatment for melanoma. And then nothing really started to happen until kind of 2011. And that's when we started to have the emergence of targeted therapies, vemurafenib with the BRAF inhibitor, and then ipilimumab, which was an immunotherapy CTLA-4 inhibitor. And we've just exploded over the last sort of 13 years with lots of new drug approvals. And most recently, TIL therapy, actually 2024 is what that should say. We've seen that just advance dramatically over these last 10 to 15 years. And that's all because of clinical trials and research and being able to move our bar. And as a result, what you're seeing is people living longer, right? And better and free of cancer. So if you had back in 2009, our overall survival rates with metastatic melanoma were really poor, right? Only about 1 in 20 people survived 5+ years with metastatic melanoma at that time. And now you're seeing over 50%. Of course, we've still got a long way to go, and that's why it's still important that we push clinical trials and find new drugs and better ways to treat people. So what is a clinical trial? Well, it's a research study that's testing new medical treatment or some sort of intervention in people to determine its safety and effectiveness. There's all different types of trials and research trials. There's just plain observational trials. We're just watching and seeing what are happening to people. interventional trials, which may be some type of therapy, or it might be not a true drug treatment, but some other intervention. For instance, we've got things like, can iPads, help improve, how people take medicines and report side effects and all those types of things, and being able to report that back to us. So, those are also things we look at to see how we can improve patient care. Therapeutic trials, those are going to get the most highlighting the most, because that's where we're trying new drugs, new types of medicines, new types of other treatments to see if we can improve patient survival. Non-therapeutic trials, again, other types of interventions you could use. Diagnostic trials, right? Can we do better PET scans? Can we do better other treatments? Can we have better things like skin mapping to detect patients' melanomas earlier, and similarly screening trials? Would things like mole mapping be more effective to screen people versus other things? So those are all some of the highlights of different types of trials that can be done, and people can get involved in those at any type of situation where they're at. So when we think hard about true interventional clinical trials, we think about phases of clinical trials. So you'll hear different phases. There's, of course, preclinical trials where we're looking, that's really what's happening in a lab, what's happening when we look at cancer cells and how we look at it under a microscope and treat them with different types of new therapies. It might be looking at mouse models or other types of interventions to see could medicines could compounds be potentially effective to actually make them into some sort of drug. Then that leads essentially into a phase 1 clinical trial. And that's where we've got a new drug, maybe a new drug combination that we're trying to see. First and foremost, is it safe to give to people? Typically, phase 1 drugs are going to start at a very low dose, and they ramp up the dosing fairly quickly, but just to make sure that it's safe to give to people, that there's not too many side effects, right? We don't want to give medicines. We don't want to make the treatments worse than the disease. So we're trying to find out that delicate balance. And that's really where phase 1 trials are focused on. But they're also starting to see, is it effective? Can you get a signal with different types of cancer? A lot of phase 1 trials might actually be all comers, looking at melanoma and colon cancer and lots of other different types. And then if there's a big signal in melanoma, then we're going to expand that out. Sometimes there's expansion trials of a phase 1 that might get a little bit of a bigger group for a particular type of cancer, just to see if there's more of a treatment response, and also to get more information on safety. Then we move into phase 2 trials. Phase 2 trials are, hey, we've looked at this drug, we've found some safe dosing, we think it's safe to continue to proceed with this medicine. There seems to be enough of an early signal that there's some responses that it seems like a worthwhile thing to continue to pursue. And so phase 2 trials are going to be a lot more patients, but usually anywhere from 30 to 100 or 30 to 200 sometimes patients. So it's a bigger group, and we're really trying to see, is it effective? And we continue to look at safety as well with a bigger group, make sure there's not any other adverse events that we didn't capture in the phase 1 trials. Most of the time, phase 2 trials are going to be getting that intervention, maybe that intervention plus a standard of care, those types of things. Then we move into phase 3 trials. They're much bigger studies. They're usually comparing whatever this new therapy is to a standard of care, or as I said, it might be that we're comparing, this with the standard of care versus just the standard of care. And so those are much bigger trials, and those are what usually lead to an FDA approval of a medicine. And then there are phase 4 trials, which are kind of like a look back. Medicine's already been approved. So let's say ipilimumab and nivolumab got approved, and we run a phase 4 study just to really monitor safety when we're looking at a much bigger population. So that's really a treatment that's already been approved, but we're continuing to monitor safety, because to us, that's by far the most important thing, is we want to make sure medicines are safe for people. Which leads us to this: are clinical trials safe? A lot goes into clinical trial research before a new drug ever is given to a person or a patient. and that's things called institutional review boards. So IRBs are very focused on safety. They want to make sure a new medicine is safe. They want to make sure a protocol is safe and it's being done right. And so there's each sort of research institutions have their IRBs that really are focused on safety and reviewing protocols. Informed consent is extremely important, right? We want to make sure that patients know what they're signing up for, what the purpose of the study is for. And so that's a very important thing. It's not, we don't want to just, people shouldn't be guinea pigs ultimately. They need to know what they're dealing with and why they're getting on a clinical trial. And so that's why informed consent's so important. And we're always weighing those benefits of the potential benefits of a trial versus the risk. And it's important that, your doctor talks about those, the person running the clinical trial talks about those. And constantly is making sure that these are safe for people ultimately. The other thing we hear a lot about is placebo. People get scared about a clinical trial because they think, well, gosh, you're just going to give me a placebo. And so what is a placebo? Well, that's usually not a true medicine, right? It's going to be a pill that doesn't have any activity, or an infusion that's just saline, things like that. And those can be part of clinical trials, but I'll tell you, by and large, clinical trials are not, they're typically using placebos to compare to the new medicine, but patients are often receiving some sort of standard of care already as part of the clinical trial. So for the vast majority of trials, you're never walking in just getting a placebo. You're typically getting something else as well. And I'll give an example of that in a second. Blinded, what does that mean? That means that a lot of times, especially in phase 3 clinical trials, your doctor doesn't actually know what therapy you're getting. And there's a purpose for that. And that is, we don't want to influence the results of the clinical trial. And so people are randomized in a kind of a flip of the coin matter, right? We have these computer algorithms that patients are randomized into 1 or 2 or 3 different arms, whatever it might be, and often the doctor is blinded. Not all studies are blinded. Phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials are typically not blinded. We know what the patients are getting. Occasionally, phase 3 trials are not blinded, but so that's part of something to talk about with your doctor, and something I always try to talk with my patients about. So here's an example of a trial that we had in our network, and I think many of us were involved in, that just recently close to enrollment, but is still active. So this was a phase 3 clinical trial looking at a personalized cancer vaccine in addition to pembrolizumab for patients after surgery with people for melanoma. So these were patients with high-risk stage 2 melanoma, stage 3 melanoma, or stage 4 melanoma, in which they had no evidence of disease. They'd already been surgically resected, but had yet to receive any therapy. And so the standard of care right now would be to put them on some sort of adjuvant therapy, or at least offer that for this patient population. And that could be immunotherapy with drugs like pembrolizumab. Nivolumab would be another option as well. Potentially targeted therapies also would be an option in this population. But pembrolizumab is truly a standard of care in this population. And so what this study looked at is pembrolizumab by itself, which again, that's the standard of care, versus pembrolizumab with this personalized cancer vaccine. And so patients were randomized to be either in this arm or this arm. It was actually in a 2-to-1 fashion. So for every 3 patients, 2 patients were in this arm and 1 patient was just in the standard of care arm. Again, investigators like myself had no idea which arm the patients actually were in. So I was blinded to what treatment they're receiving. And so it's a randomized blinded study essentially, and we'll wait to see what the results of that are as we continue these patients on this trial and ultimately see what the outcomes are. So that's an example of kind of a blinded randomized study. How do we know if clinical trials work? Well, you saw a lot of great data from about targeted therapy and immunotherapy about improving outcomes. And that's ultimately how we know if they work. We have to follow patients through time, and it's a population of patients. And we're seeing our clinical trials seeming to benefit people. In a phase 3 clinical trial like this one, which Dr. Waite showed earlier, which is which was ipilimumab, nivolumab versus nivolumab versus ipilimumab in metastatic melanoma patients. Well, we followed these patients through time, and ultimately we saw that if you got that combination treatment, more patients were alive 5 to 10 years later than if you just got ipilimumab or in this case nivolumab by itself. And there's some nuances to that and whatnot, but that's how we ultimately know, do clinical trials work? As how do people respond? And then obviously we want to know, how are they safe? What are the ramifications of these treatments? What side effects do they get? Because unfortunately they do all come with side effects that we have to deal with. So metastatic patients, often we have tumors we can follow, right? We can see if the tumor shrinks, if there's a response. And so a lot of times we know it's working based on response rate, not just long-term outcomes. In patients who already had surgery and have no active disease left, we don't always know, we don't have a tumor to follow. And so those would be like the study I just presented earlier, where we were giving a new treatment after surgery. Well, in that case, we really have to follow patients over time to see if their cancer does come back. And so an example of this would be pembrolizumab given for stage 3 melanoma patients after surgery. At that time, there was no standard of care. It was just surgery, and we'd watch people. So pembrolizumab was compared to just a placebo. And again, placebo was the standard of care at that time. And what we saw as we followed people is that if you got pembrolizumab, you were less likely to have a recurrence of your melanoma than if you had placebo for that group of patients. So then we knew, okay, pembrolizumab is an effective treatment for this population. We use a lot of heavy statistical analysis, and we've got a lot of statisticians on these trials to help us kind of figure all these things out and know if it's a statistically significant result. Unfortunately, there's a lot of disparities in clinical trials, and that's something we as investigators continue to work on, and it's a big thing. And I think a big thing with Sarah Cannon Research Institute that we really try to focus on. Clinical trials are the foundation of drug development for cancer. It's critical that these trials represent the real world. They need to represent who are the patients out there, not just a small subset of patients. Unfortunately, there's fewer than 5% of patients with cancer that ever receive treatment on a clinical trial, and it's probably even much less than 5%, honestly. Historically, only 23% of oncology trials were conducted in the community, even though about 80 to 85% of patients actually get treated in that setting. So these trials were being conducted only at big cancer centers and not across the community. And that's where kind of the dream of a Sarah Cannon Research Institute is, hey, we need to get these trials out to the community, out across the country. And also because of that, patients who were older, over 70, even though they represent 42% of the cancer population, only represent about 24% of the trial population, and they represent less than 10% of NCI-sponsored trials. So, we're using therapies on these patients that are older that never were part of the clinical trial. So it's important that these patients get involved. It's important that we figure out how to get it to, make it more ethnically diverse as well. Unfortunately, if we looked at who gets involved in clinical trials, and this was just kind of looking at patients who did report their race over a 10-year period in oncology, the vast majority are white or Asian, a much smaller population of Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations. So we have a lot of work to do to continue to get trials to these underrepresented populations, because probably drugs can act different across different populations. And so we really need to know that information better. And we need to make clinical trials more accessible for people. If you look across the United States, this is a little map looking at geographic accessibility of cancer clinical trials by regions. And this is actually looking at metastatic breast cancer, not melanoma, but I think it's a similar concept. And in fact, even probably even in melanoma, where it's a less common tumor type, it's probably even more disparate, worse access. And so if you look, kind of in the Northeast, those patients just because it's a more condensed area, they can probably find clinical trials within an hour of where they live. Along the coast, a smaller percentage can access clinical trials. As we get into the South, and of course these mountain regions, these are areas where they do not have very good access to clinical trials. The vast majority of the population live over an hour away from a clinical trial. So that's why we need to bring these trials to the people, I think. And so that's where traditionally we have these centralized models. You got a huge clinical trial or a huge cancer center run that has clinical trials there. And people have to get to that big, huge cancer center. And really, Sarah Cannon's probably more in this hybrid model where we have local participation, we have partnerships where we're bringing actual clinical trials into our community practices. And I think our goal would be, could we do even more of this shared care model where we could run research in any cancer center across the United States that we have access to, and use oversight with kind of principal investigators who are really involved in the clinical trial to help their local oncologists bring these new treatments to patients. So that's the dream. I think we're kind of more in the middle right now, where we have a lot of research centers set up across the United States, but they're still not in our very small offices. So we have to continue to move towards that so we can get more access for patients. That's the dream. Sarah Cannon Research Institute is a huge network of oncology cancer centers across the United States. Over 1,300 research physicians, over 250 locations in 24 states. And so we're trying to bring all these trials to all these little dots across the United States, basically. And if we do it successfully, we can reach 1 in 5 patients with cancer across the United States, which is remarkable. If you're thinking about a clinical trial, what questions to ask? Ask your doctor, what's the purpose of this study? Is it to see if the dose of this drug? Is it to see if this drug's going to beat out the standard of care? Ask those questions. How long will the study last? What are my other options? I always try with patients to just lay out, hey, here's the standard of care. Here's this clinical trial and why I think it might be good for you. And it's not good for everybody. Not everybody is a perfect candidate for clinical trials or wants to be on a clinical trial, but I think it's important for us to talk through it with people. Ask, how do the tests in the study compare with those I would have outside of the trial? Am I going to have a lot of extra testing? Is it going to be a lot of extra driving to the center? What does that mean? And again, that's where I think bringing these trials closer to patients is important so that it doesn't disrupt their life as much. And will I have to pay for any part of the trial? Typically, most clinical trials, anything experimental is paid for by the clinical trial. Sometimes the trial is even paying for even a standard of care drug. Other times it's paying for certainly extra studies, but there's a work with the insurance on what gets paid for by the trial, what gets paid for by insurance. And that's always something to discuss. Currently, all insurances are supposed to accept clinical trials as part of a treatment for cancer patients. And then how do I find clinical trials? It's confusing. There's clinical trials all across the U.S. And it's, people often say, oh, I need to go here for a clinical trial. And the reality is there's clinical trials spread across everywhere. We may have a clinical trial at my office that somebody else doesn't, across town or across the state, and vice versa. And so important to kind of look at different options and really talk that through with the oncologist, see what their thoughts are about it. Clinicaltrials.gov is kind of the big database of clinical trials. It can be a little cumbersome to look through, and probably need some interpretation with your oncologist or with some other people to really help guide you through that. What's on there, what's available. Organizations like AIM at Melanoma can help. Next generation sequencing reports that a lot of our patients should be getting also have information about potential clinical trials based on the patient's mutations. Artificial intelligence is trying to get there to help patients with clinical trial findings. So hopefully that continues to improve as well. back to our patient, this 2014, she had wildly metastatic melanoma. At the time, I was involved with the protocol for ipilimumab and nivolumab. I offered that to her as a clinical trial versus just getting ipilimumab by itself, I think at the time, and for a standard of care. She went on that clinical trial. She ended up being randomized to the dual therapy. And she went into complete remission, and she's still alive 10 years later today, which is awesome. And so that's why I do that's why I get involved with clinical trials, is to see these potential outcomes and how we can change people's lives. And now how we're using this treatment in clinic all the time to treat people and having these outcomes. But we still have a lot of work to do, right? We still have a lot of work to do. But we're getting better. This is when I was young, I'd play Tecmo Bowl. It was pretty, pixelated. Couldn't do a whole lot. My son plays Madden all the time now. They can do like a million different things, and he beats me all the time at it. But we're evolving, getting better, making things better all the time. So thank you to all of our patients and families. Thank you for attending this, and happy to answer any questions at our Q&A session.